Every story has a room that the main narrative moves past too quickly. The death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the crisis at Saqifah, the Bai'ah of Abu Bakr, the dispatching of Usamah's army, the organization of the 11 banners. These events move with the momentum of a civilization managing its own continuity, one decision after another, each decision driven by urgency, each urgency displacing the previous one. History told at the level of states and campaigns has no choice but to move at that speed. But in a house in al-Madinah, connected to the mosque by a door that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself had used, a man sat with his dying wife and did not move at all. Ali ibn Abi Talib was 30 years old. His father-in-law was dead. His wife, the daughter of that man, the woman about whom her father had said, "I am a part of her, whoever harms her harms me," was dying. The caliphate had been decided without him. The community was moving forward with the urgent business of its survival. And Ali sat in that house with Fatimah al-Zahra and watched the weeks pass and said almost nothing. This episode is about that silence, what it contained, what it cost, and what it ultimately produced, not a schism, not a revolt, but a bai'ah given freely by a man who had every reason to withhold it, and a relationship between Ali ibn Abi Talib and the first caliphate of Islam that was more complex, more honest, and more human than the polemics of later centuries have been willing to allow. And if you are new to this channel, this is the episode that tells you who Ali ibn Abi Talib actually was. Not the symbol that later movements made him, the man. Subscribe so you are here for the full arc of his story across this season. It does not end here. To understand Ali's position in the weeks after the Prophet's death, you have to begin where his story actually begins, not at Saqifah, not at the question of succession, but in the household of Abu Talib, in Mecca, a decade before the first revelation. Ali ibn Abi Talib was born into the family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the most direct sense available outside of blood descent. When Abu Talib, the Prophet's uncle, his protector, the man who kept him safe through the years of Meccan persecution, found himself in financial difficulty, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his uncle Abbas each took one of Abu Talib's sons to raise in their own households. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam took Ali. He was perhaps 5 or 6 years old. He grew up in the Prophet's house. He slept there, ate there, learned there. He was present for the first revelation, not as a bystander, but as a member of the household, the child who had been living under that roof when the man of the house came back from the cave of Hira, shaking and frightened, and wrapped in a blanket. He was among the first to hear the words. He was among the first to accept them. The sources are unambiguous that Ali was the first male to accept Islam. He was 9 or 10 years old. He had been raised by the man who received the revelation. There was no distance in him between hearing and believing, because the man he had watched his entire conscious life was the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when that man said Allah had spoken to him, Ali had no reservoir of doubt to draw from. He grew up inside Islam the way other children grow up inside a language. It was not adopted, it was native. The obligations of the faith, the character of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the meaning of the revelation, these were not external frameworks. Ali later encountered and accepted. They were the air he breathed from childhood. By the time he was 20, he had already fought at Badr. By 25, he had carried the standard at Khaybar. By 30, the morning the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam died, he had spent essentially his entire life at the center of most significant human story of his age. And now that story had a different center, and it was not him. The question of what Ali expected regarding succession has been argued by historians and theologians for 14 centuries, with a heat that has not diminished. Setting aside the later theological frameworks that hardened this question into sectarian positions, what the sources actually tell us is more modest and more human. Ali believed himself the most qualified. This was not arrogance. By the measures that would have been recognizable to any Arabian of his era, depth of knowledge, closeness to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, years of service, military capacity, legal acuity, family connection. Ali ibn Abi Talib had a legitimate claim to be considered. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had praised him repeatedly in public. He had called him the gate of the city of knowledge. He had made him his standard-bearer at the most critical battles. He had, at Ghadir come on the return from the farewell pilgrimage, made a statement whose precise political meaning has been debated ever since, but whose personal warmth was unmistakable. Whoever has me as their Mawla has Ali as their Mawla. What Ali did not have was a formal designation. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had not appointed him caliph. He had not appointed anyone caliph. The question of political succession had been left, by design or by the mercy of Allah, removing the weight of that designation from any single person's shoulders, to the community itself. And the community at Saqifah had moved without consulting Banu Hashim. The objection that Ali and his kinsmen raised was not, according to the sources, primarily that Abu Bakr was unworthy. It was procedural. They had not been consulted. The funeral arrangements had occupied them. The sacred obligation to the Prophet's body had kept Ali, Abbas, Fadl ibn Abbas, and the household in Aisha's room, while the political transition was being managed in a hall on the other side of the city. By the time they were finished with what mattered most, the washing, the shrouding, the burial of the man they loved, the matter had been decided. Ali's own account of this period, preserved in the sources with a directness that argues against later invention, is remarkable for its absence of bitterness. When he was later asked, directly, in Basra, by men who wanted him to say that he had been robbed, he refused to say it. He said, "Had the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam designated me, I would never have allowed Abu Bakr and Umar to lead the people from the pulpit. I accepted them because they were worthy. My complaint was only that I was not consulted." That sentence, "I accepted them because they were worthy," is the key that unlocks the entire relationship between Ali and the first two caliphs. It is not the statement of a man performing reluctant compliance for political reasons. It is the statement of a man who had deeply internalized the Prophet's framework for evaluating fitness for leadership, and who had applied that framework honestly and arrived at a conclusion he did not prefer but could not honestly dispute. Abu Bakr was worthy. Ali knew it. He said it. He said it in Basra, in front of men who wanted him to say otherwise, and he did not change his account to please them. But the weeks of silence before the formal Bai'ah were real, and they deserve examination rather than apology. Ali did not rush to the mosque the morning after Saqifah to place his hand in Abu Bakr's. He did not arrive at the general Bai'ah with the crowd. He and the men of Banu Hashim remained in their grief, in their houses, at some remove from the ceremonial proceedings that were establishing the new order. The sources offer different accounts of how long this lasted. Some say days. Some say 40 days. Some say 6 months, but this figure almost certainly conflates Ali's delayed formal Bai'ah with the subsequent events around Fatimah's illness and death, which did continue for 6 months. The most careful reconstruction suggests that Ali gave his formal public Bai'ah within weeks of Saqifah, perhaps after Fatimah's initial condition became clear, perhaps after a specific conversation with Abu Bakr that the sources preserve in some detail. That conversation is worth reconstructing. Ali came to Abu Bakr. He acknowledged that he harbored no doubt about Abu Bakr's virtue and no objection to his being the most qualified of those available for the responsibility. His complaint, he said, was that Banu Hashim, the immediate family of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, had not been included in the consultation. Had they been called to Saqifah, they would have given their Bai'ah before anyone else. Abu Bakr's response was honest and direct. The crisis in that hall had been moving too fast for deliberate consultation. The Ansar were on the edge of choosing their own leader. Every minute of delay was a minute in which the unity of the community was at risk. He had not excluded Banu Hashim from contempt. He had acted in the only window that existed. Ali accepted this explanation, not because he was forced to, because it was true, and in the mosque, before the community, he gave his hand to Abu Bakr. What does that moment mean? It means that the first succession crisis of the Islamic State, a crisis that the enemies of Islam and the internal hypocrites had been hoping would tear the community apart, was resolved not by force, not by political maneuvering, not by the suppression of legitimate grievance, but by two men of extraordinary character choosing honesty over position. Abu Bakr could have resented Ali's delay. He did not. The sources do not record a single statement from Abu Bakr expressing irritation or suspicion toward Ali during this period. He waited. He continued his work. He sent no ultimatum and applied no pressure. Ali could have nursed his grievance into permanent opposition. He did not. He looked at the situation clearly, acknowledged what was true, and acted on it. This is not a story about power being transferred smoothly. It is a story about two men managing a genuine tension with genuine honesty, and the community surviving as a result. The complexity of the moment is its most important feature. Sanitizing it into a simple, harmonious transition dishonors both men. Inflating it into an irreparable rupture dishonors them even more. The rupture, when it eventually came, was not at Saqifah. It was 30 years later, in a different world, under pressures that neither of these men created. But there is a grief in this period that political history is not built to carry, and it must be carried here, because it is the actual center of Ali ibn Abi Talib's experience in these months. Fatimah al-Zahra was dying. She had been the last child of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to survive into adulthood. 3 sons had died in infancy. Her older sisters had died before her. She alone remained, the daughter of Khadija and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the woman who had washed the filth from her father's back when the Quraysh poured entrails on him in the mosque, the woman who had wept when her father told her she would be the first of his household to join him after his death, and then smiled when he told her she would be the leader of the women of paradise. She had heard the first part of that prophecy fulfilled. She was now living the second part. The illness came quickly after the Prophet's death. Whether it was grief making physical what had been spiritual, the body following the heart into its diminishment, or whether it was an illness that had been approaching before and was simply unmasked by the shock of loss, the sources do not resolve with certainty. What they are clear on is that Fatimah al-Zahra, in the months following her father's death, was visibly fading. Ali was her husband. He had been her husband since she was approximately 18 years old, in the 2nd year after the Hijrah. He had asked for her hand, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had given it. And what followed was not an arrangement, but a love, attested to in the sources by the directness of Ali's grief when she died, by the careful tenderness of the accounts of their household, by the fact that Ali did not take another wife while Fatima lived, which was not the norm for the era, and was not unremarkable. He sat with her. He managed the household. He was present for whatever time remained. In this same period, this period of sitting at his wife's bedside while his father-in-law's caliphate organized itself around him, Ali was also thinking. He was thinking about the question of Fadak. Fadak was a fertile estate in the Hijaz, near Khaybar, that had come into the Prophet's possession after the conquest of Khaybar as territory taken without battle. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had used its revenues for specific purposes, supporting his family, supporting guests and delegations, contributing to public needs. After his death, Fatima claimed that her father had given Fadak to her as a gift during his lifetime. Abu Bakr, applying the principle he understood from a specific hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "We prophets do not leave inheritance, what we leave is charity," declined to hand it over to Fatima as personal inheritance. This became a dispute. It became a painful one. The sources are clear that Fatima went to Abu Bakr and made her claim. The sources are also clear that Abu Bakr applied what he understood to be the Prophet's own principle to her claim, and declined to set it aside. He was not dismissive of her. The accounts describe him as deeply pained by the situation. Pained precisely because he loved the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he loved the Prophet's family, and he was being asked to choose between his personal feeling and what he understood to be the Prophet's own rule, and he chose the rule. Fatimah was grieved. She did not, according to some accounts, speak to Abu Bakr again before her death. This is the most painful detail of the entire episode, and it should not be softened. A woman who had lost her father was now in a dispute with the man who had been her father's closest friend, over property she believed her father had intended for her, and she died with that dispute unresolved. Ali maintained his bai'ah to Abu Bakr through all of this. He did not use Fatimah's grief as a political weapon. He did not organize opposition, did not seek to reopen the succession question, did not withdraw from the community. He served. He gave legal opinions when asked. He was present at the mosque. This is the texture of the man that later centuries often lost in the heat of sectarian argument. A man who held his personal grief and his political disagreement and his legitimate sense of exclusion in one hand, and his honest assessment of what the community needed and what the faith required in the other, and chose the second hand. Not because the first hand was empty, because the second hand was heavier. There is another dimension to this period that sits beneath the political surface and belongs to the full portrait. Ali ibn Abi Talib was, by any measure, one of the most intellectually formidable human beings of his era. His depth in the Quran was not merely memorization. It was the kind of engagement that produces original insight, that finds connections between verses that others miss, that understands the jurisprudential implications of a passage before the broader scholarly community has formalized them. Umar ibn al-Khattab, who would succeed Abu Bakr and would have his own complex relationship with Ali, said of him with the bluntness for which Umar was known, "Among all of us, Ali is the most knowledgeable in judgment." This was not flattery. It was a professional assessment from a man who did not flatter. And this depth of knowledge was not politically convenient for Ali in this period, because the depth of his knowledge meant he understood, with complete clarity, the precedents being established by Abu Bakr's caliphate, the precedents about the nature of the caliph's authority, the relationship between the caliph and the prophet's example, the framework within which the community's leadership would operate. He understood these precedents better than most of the people around him. He contributed to their development, offering legal counsel when Abu Bakr asked for it, and offering it honestly. There is a scene preserved in the sources, small, easy to overlook, that captures something essential. Abu Bakr, during his caliphate, encountered a legal question he could not resolve from the Quran or the Hadith he knew. He assembled the senior companions and asked whether any of them knew a ruling from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the matter. Ali gave the ruling. Abu Bakr accepted it. That was the transaction. The caliph asked, the scholar answered, the community benefited. Ali did not withhold his knowledge, because he thought the caliphate had been wrongly constituted. His knowledge belonged to the community, not to his political position, and he gave it to the community regardless of whether the community had honored him in the way he believed he deserved. This is the character of the man. Not a saint. He was too human, too obviously feeling his grief and his displacement for that, but a man whose deepest formation held even when the pressure was at its highest. A man who had been raised in the Prophet's house and had absorbed something there that could not be taken from him by Saqifah, or by Fadak, or by the long months of watching his wife diminish and disappear. Fatimah al-Zahra died in Jumada al-Akhira, 6 months after her father. She was approximately 27 years old. The sources preserve her final days with care. She asked to be buried at night, quietly, without the public ceremony that her position as the Prophet's daughter would have attracted. She did not want her grave to become a destination, a site of excessive mourning, a place where grief was institutionalized, rather than carried privately. She asked Ali to wash and prepare her body himself, which he did. She was buried in the night, in al-Baqi, in the cemetery that holds the bodies of so many of the early community. Ali buried her. He stood at her grave, And then he did something that the sources record with a simplicity that lands with the force of the most careful composition. He turned toward the grave of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the grave in the room next to the mosque, the grave of the man who had been his guardian and his father figure and his prophet and his father-in-law, and he spoke. The words are preserved in Ali's own voice, addressed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as though he were present. He said, "O Prophet of Allah, your daughter has come to you. She will tell you how your ummah united against her. Ask her, for she knows." This is not a political statement. This is a man standing at the grave of his wife and speaking to the grave of her father, carrying a grief that had no other address. The complexity of his relationship with the caliphate, the pain of the Fadak dispute, the long months of sitting at Fatimah's bedside while the world moved forward, all of it distilled into a few sentences spoken to the dead. After the burial, Ali returned to Abu Bakr. He told him what had happened, the relationship between the two men, which had been held at some tension during the months of Fatimah's illness, not by hostility but by the delicacy of the situation, found its equilibrium again. Ali's formal engagement with the caliphate, already present in the legal opinions and the counsel he had been offering, became more visible. The distance, whatever it had been, closed. Now step back and hold the full picture. What this period, from Saqifah to Fatimah's death, 6 months in the life of the early Islamic state, actually represents is something that civilizations almost never produce. An honest reckoning between legitimately competing claims, managed by people of sufficient character that the reckoning did not destroy what they were managing it to protect. Ali had a legitimate grievance about the process of Saqifah. He acknowledged it. Abu Bakr had made a consequential decision without consulting the Prophet's family. He acknowledged it. Fatimah had a genuine claim to Fadak that she pursued through the proper channel, even knowing it might fail. The failure hurt her and Ali and left a mark on the relationship. None of that is erased. None of it should be erased. What it did not become was a civil war. What it did not become was a permanent rupture in the community's fabric. What it did not become, and this requires the greatest emphasis, was what later polemicists on all sides tried to make it, either a seamless and conflict-free transition in which everyone was perfectly happy, or an irreparable betrayal in which the faith was corrupted at its root. It was a human story. Imperfect people, enormous stakes, genuine feeling, genuine principle, and enough character in the central figures that the imperfection was managed without catastrophe. The catastrophe, when it came, would be managed by different people, under different pressures, in a different world. That story belongs to the final arc of this season. For now, the community held. Ali ibn Abi Talib was 30 years old, a widower, the father of Hassan and Hussein and 2 daughters, the most legally learned man in al-Madinah, and the caliph was Abu Bakr al-Siddiq. He went to the mosque. He led prayers when asked. He gave legal opinions when asked. He was present. And in the background of everything he did in these years, running like a quiet current beneath the surface of his public service, the knowledge that a time would come, not that he was owed power, not that the community had made an error it needed to correct, but that the work the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had started was continuing, that the faith was real, that the obligations were real, and that whatever role he was given in the service of both, that role he would fill with everything he had. The next episode returns to the wars. In The Caliph Goes to War, we will watch Abu Bakr put on his armor and ride out of al-Madinah himself, and we will watch the first coalition of apostate tribes discover what they have chosen to fight. The caliphate is no longer defending. It is advancing. And if you want the full depth of Ali ibn Abi Talib's story, where he comes from, what he was shaped to be, the Season 1 episodes on his early life and his role at Badr and Khaybar are the foundation for everything this season will ask of him. Both the next episode and the Season 1 context are linked on your screen and in the description. If you have not subscribed yet, do it now. The algorithm will not show you the next battle unless you are subscribed. And if this episode gave you something, share it. One share from you puts this history in front of someone who has never heard it told this way. This is the House of Wisdom, where history is never just the past.